and welcome to The Salty Writer, where we talk about writing, creativity, books, publishing, and the wonderfully strange business of building a writing life. This is episode 32, Beds Empty, Car Gone, Finding Story Magic in Everyday Life. I'm your host, Millie Story, and I write science fiction under the pen name of Melissa L. Story, and also Lynn Story for my contemporary romance series, Gates Point. My books have been downloaded in over 52 countries. I'm a novelist, reader, podcaster, obviously, and creative soul who loves talking about writing, books, publishing, and the winding road of creative life. So whether you're a new writer, just beginning to find your voice, or perhaps a more experienced writer still learning and growing, like me, a devoted reader, or simply someone who loves a good story, I'm so glad you found this podcast. This week, I have a quick personal update to share with you. So this week, sorry, there was a pause there. I was checking on Pearl. So this week, or last week really, I was on vacation. I'm a little behind schedule getting this recorded. And while I was doing all the vacationing things, I started to think about how that time changes the way we notice the things around us when we're not quite so busy and rushing from point A to point B and meeting to meeting and things like that. So when we step out of our usual routine, even for a little while, ordinary objects and moments seem to shine just a little bit differently. That happened to me this week in a few small ways. I found myself noticing this really cool geode in a store, one of those rough little rocks that looks plain enough on one side, but on the inside, when it opens up, it turns into something very beautiful and completely unexpected. And honestly, what a perfect image for writing. So much of storytelling feels like that. You start with something ordinary, a sentence, a memory, a moment, a conversation, a small object on a shelf, and you crack it open just a little bit, kind of explore the meaning behind it, or take a look at the experience that is evoked with that object. And suddenly, there's all this color inside that maybe you never noticed before. I also visited a wonderful little bookstore in Williamsburg, and there's just something about walking through the bookstore that resets part of my brain. The covers and the titles, the shelves so full of promise for all those stories waiting to be discovered. And it reminds me that books are still those little small portable miracles that we can carry around with us. And then closer to home, there was the simple joy of making a spaghetti sauce from the tomatoes and peppers I grew in my own garden. There's just something deeply satisfying about that. You grow something, gather it up, chop it, simmer it, season it, and somehow all of those separate little pieces combine into one rich thing, a sauce, or maybe a novel. A story is rarely born from one single lightning strike. More often, it comes from a handful of ingredients gathered over time, a bit of memory or dialogue, a place you visited perhaps, a feeling you can't quite shake, a trip to a bookstore, time in your garden, or a strange little rock you find glittering on a shelf. And that's really what I want to talk to you about this week, is how writers can find inspiration in everyday life and transform it into something fresh, surprising, and full of story. So let's settle in and get started. Make sure you have something nice to drink with you and you're either sitting comfortably or driving safely in case you're commuting. So let's talk about inspiration. And I know that word gets thrown around a lot in writing circles. Inspiration can sound like something grand and mysterious, that mysterious muse, as if a writer must stand on some windswept cliff in a velvet cape gazing towards the sea while lightning flashes in the distance with every idea that you need to have for a book. And that all sounds dramatic and a little chilly, but I would probably be wondering who was responsible for bringing the snacks. And those windswept cliffs can get a little chilly and they're kind of desolate. The truth is much simpler, though, much more useful, of course. So inspiration often begins in ordinary life. It begins with a turn of a phrase or something that we hear every day, or moments or traditions from our family, and just those little snippets of human behavior that for some reason stand out in a particular moment when any other time you would have not even noticed. So to that point, I was out doing some thrifting and antiquing this week while I was off, and I found this enamel pen that read, "Open your books to page 394. Now, if you know, you know. And naturally, I bought it. But it made me think about ordinary things that can become extraordinary. I mean, if you're not familiar with the quote, "Open your book to page 394, it doesn't really seem all that exciting. And one of the best examples of a quote, a movie quote from Harry Potter, and if you don't know, that enamel pen was quoting Professor Snape, and turning your books to page 394 is boring until it's spoken by a wizard. So that kind of changes things a little bit. But also in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Mrs. Weasley wakes up and discovers that the boys in the flying car are gone. And she catches them sneaking back into the house, where she delivers the line, "Bed's empty, no note, car gone." I love that line. It's honestly one of my favorite lines in the whole movie. And the reason I think it's so brilliant is because it's an everyday line. Those are words that have probably been spoken by parents around the world for generations. And in some version, that sentence is going to hit home with so many of us. We learn when to sneak out, and we wander, and we borrow things, and we made deeply questionable decisions with complete confidence. But when you got back home, the confidence was shattered. And your mom or your dad or grandma or aunt were standing there, probably with their hands on their hips, demanding to know where you were. Why didn't you tell them when you would be back or where you were going? What happened to the car? Why are your clothes muddy? I mean, some variation of that sentence has been spoken for generations. And it speaks volumes to when you hear it in a different light. And I know when I was a teenager, leaving handwritten notes was a thing. There weren't cell phones yet. So, there was no texting your mom or your dad to tell them where you were going, who you were going with. So it was always a big rule in our house to leave a note. So leaving a note seems like such an ordinary thing, But this story does something a little bit different and completely wonderful. It takes that everyday parental panic and places it inside a magic world. Suddenly, that missing car that you borrowed without your parents' permission is a flying car, and the boys are wizards, and the household is full of magic, and the mother's a witch, and suddenly that ordinary line has a different spin on it, a different take on it. It evokes a more intensified, maybe, memory for you because the world around it changed. It wasn't simply mom standing in the kitchen chastising children who had snuck off and borrowed a car. And I think this is a really important craft lesson, and I don't think anyone does it much better than J.K. Rowling. I mean, the whole series is, you can find those everyday events or phrases that she somehow takes and just molds them into this new, fabulously magical world, and the words are completely different. So sometimes the spark of a story doesn't come from inventing something wildly unfamiliar. Sometimes it's just taking something that everyone would recognize and moving it into a different setting, or change the circumstances for why these words are being spoken. So the familiar part of that scene in the movie and those specific words that are spoken, and that gives the reader or moviegoer, in this instance it's both, a real foothold into the story. So if you take something that your mom has said to you 1,000 times and you use those same words, but you put them in different context or put them in a different world, maybe instead of someone saying it to a child, they're speaking the words to a dragon. That context makes a huge difference. And while there's familiarity in the words, which grabs your reader's attention, the fact that they're being spoken to a dragon gives them all new delight as a reader. They've never imagined those words being spoken in that context before. So now you've got their attention and their emotion. They're invested now. They need to find out more. What has the dragon done? What's going on? Why is there a dragon, there? So a mother worrying about children sneaking out is, of course, familiar. But the fact that the kids stole a car that flies, that's really investing your reader into the story. They're going to need more information. How and why does this car fly, and where did they take it? Where would you go in a flying car? The balance is powerful for writers, especially newer writers who may feel pressured to come up with some idea that they felt like never existed before, or in some form that never existed before. But here's the good news. Most stories are built from recognizable human material: love, fear, jealousy, ambition, pride, wonder, the ache to belong, the desire to prove yourself. So these emotions are old, even ancient, and they've been with us since people were painting on cave walls and probably complaining about the mammoth looking better in the first draft. What makes the story feel fresh, as I said before, is reframing that material. You take a family argument, and it becomes funnier when it's in a house that a clock tracks everyone's movements by spoons instead of clock hands, or a coming-of-age story when it shifts magic and sword fighting maybe to a spaceship, or there's dragon diplomacy, or maybe your character is dealing with ghost management. A love story can change flavor when lovers belong to rival kingdoms, planets, rival crime families, or even a simple rival bakery at the county fair. The emotion is familiar, but the setting is what changes. So the emotion hooks your readers. It gives them something to identify with. They can see themselves identifying or having felt that emotion, but they probably haven't felt it when they're yelling at a dragon. So that helps to give them something new and fresh. While dragons them in and of themselves aren't new and fresh, but when you take the words that you're using that has inspired you into that scene, that combination of ordinary words that we've all spoken or heard and have spoken to us, but put them in a different world building scenario, that's where the magic happens. That's where you really sink in and you have this beautiful balance of giving something to the reader that they can identify with, but then giving them a new world that they can now live in through those familiar words. And that's why the Mrs. Weasley line hits home so well for me. It gives a mother that we can all identify with, recognize, or some female elder guardian. It's a speaking rhythm that we can recognize. We probably all got in trouble for doing something we weren't supposed to do. But the world building turns that scenario sideways. And suddenly the mom is a witch and the car that you borrowed without permission flies. And you've got this whole different dynamic. So while you're reading along, you're thinking, yeah, my mom yelled at me for that once, but shoot, my car never flew, but then imagine the trouble you probably would have gotten in if it did. So this is something we can use as writers. So think about everyday moments and how they carry emotion. We've talked about a parent standing in a doorway, but what about a couple arguing about directions, or a friend showing up with bad news, someone waiting for a phone call, or finding a lost letter, or someone who pretends everything is fine when the whole room knows that it's definitely not. Those moments work because they are so human, but the writer's job is to ask what happens when we move those all too familiar human emotions into a different world and raise the stakes around it, using them to create tension that wasn't there before. So it's an emotional seed, but it just gets planted in a different garden. And yes, if you've been with me for a while, I love a garden metaphor. So this is why fairy tales, I think, remain so useful as a source of material. And there's so many retellings because they're easy to identify with. One, you've probably heard them since you were a child. And two, they use that same tool of connecting with a human emotion that we all have, feel, and experienced, but draping it in some more symbolic clothing. A girl that wants safety, a person wants freedom, someone else longs to be seen. Take a fairy tale and move it to outer space, and suddenly those old patterns light up a little differently. So what if Cinderella becomes a mechanic on a lunar colony? The story's still the same. She's trying to find, get out of maybe this bad work situation that is her work family, and she sort of has this magical evening with a stranger, that kind of rescues her. Sleeping Beauty becomes a suspended astronaut that awakes centuries later on a dying ship after being in stasis. Beauty and the Beast can become first contact with alien intelligence inside a quarantine station, or maybe Little Red Riding Hood becomes a courier crossing a dangerous asteroid belt with something in her cargo hold instead of a basket that everybody wants. So that old story can take different shape with a new setting. So what does that mean? Does it mean retelling requires copying? Absolutely not. A writer can take the same emotional engine and just build a new machine around it. The key is to understand what sits at the heart of the emotion. Once you know that, you can move it just about anywhere. So if we break down Cinderella into its parts, it's mostly about transformation, endurance, unfairness, and being recognized for your true worth. And those are certainly all things that we have felt. The emotional engine can run in a palace, a corporate office, a starship, or a haunted house. Another example, Beauty and the Beast. It's partly about fear, perception, loneliness, and the possibility that love can see past a surface story. And that too can be in a castle or an alien ship, a post-apocalyptic bunker, or a small town with a very cranky recluse and a very suspiciously well-stocked library. And lastly, Little Red Riding Hood. Now that's all about innocence, danger, deception, and the risk of wandering into a world that you don't understand. And that can be turned into horror, thriller, fantasy, science fiction, or literary suspense. So the magic comes from the transformation. That writer can take old emotional patterns and ask new questions. What would this scenario look like in the world that I've built, the world that you've built? And the question can unlock so much. So, what does a mother's worry look like in a wizarding family? What would a bedtime story look like on a starship? Or civil rivalry between immortals? So, there's so many possibilities there. So, maybe take something that you heard in school, something that a teacher said. What would that look like if it was said around your dinner table at home instead? And that's a baby step, but it gives you an idea of how you can change the context, but keeping the same emotion and the same words. So the ordinary gives us a doorway. It's speculative, romantic, mysterious, magical, and new writers can find this freeing because you don't have to sit around trying to create some new and never seen before idea, or you're waiting for ideas just to drop from the heavens wearing gold slippers. You can just pay attention to the life around you and you pick up little things. So listen to the way people talk in the grocery store. Maybe take notice of some tiny drama in a parking lot. Maybe there's a confrontation because someone's grocery cart rolled away and hit somebody's car door and an argument ensues. Well, what if the grocery cart was a shuttlecraft and the car was a spaceship and the person driving the shuttlecraft wrecked into the side of the spaceship? And you can still have a dramatic moment about that. But it's the same thing. It's something, happened accidental. Emotions were heightened, emotions flared. How people reacted could be the same. But, your car is now a shuttle and your car is now a whole spaceship. Or, maybe a knight in training isn't paying attention and he stumbles into, a dragon. There's definitely going to be drama there and tension, and you're going to create tension in the scene. And of course, that's also your goal. But what a cool way to do it. So it's kind of like watching the world go by, and as it goes by, picking something out of the air that you heard or saw and asking, well, what if? What if, a wizard said these words instead of that person standing over there in the produce aisle? So, just kind of listen closely and pick up. You don't have to quote people directly. You don't have to, jot down notes unless you can just write yourself a little quick note so you don't forget what you heard. I've heard a couple of interesting phrases sitting in restaurants before, unintentionally, but sometimes you're sitting close to another couple or another group of people. And, sometimes you have this booth where you have that little shared wall in between so you can hear people sometimes. And I heard one time a girl say, if it wasn't for my horse, I'd never would have gone to college. I was sitting in a pancake house when I heard this lady say that or this girl say that. Now, I'm sure there's some context and logic to that statement, but I couldn't hear the whole thing. That phrase just popped into my head and it's always stuck with me. It was years ago when I heard that. But hearing that, because it just seemed kind of odd. How special was this horse? What college did she go to? And I know there's lots of colleges that have equine studies and, people can take their horses, but, not here where I live. So it was just, I really needed more information, which I certainly couldn't ask for, but, I could create a story around that, or, keeping in context with what we're talking about now. Maybe someone says, well, I would have never gone to school if it hadn't been for my dragon. So many things, so many things. So again, just kind of keep an ear out for these little moments of muse that may pop up or an eye out if you see something interesting and you see, it doesn't have to be negative. I think I've used some negative examples, but, it could be a party. It could be someone celebrating, maybe two friends reunited on the sidewalk and you start to think, oh, how long has it been since they've seen each other? Maybe they're really good friends and they're huggers. So maybe it's only been a day, or maybe someone has been on a long trip or is in the military and has been gone for months and months. So there's all kinds of things. And sometimes I think, writers try very hard to make the dialogue sound so special, so, memorable for the reader. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. You want, depending on your genre, to people to make, grand declarations of love or loyalty, honor, things like that. You may struggle for elegant phrasing and have this, this big moment. And those moments certainly have their place. But not all your dialogue has to be that big. You can have everyday conversations in your dialogue. Not everything somebody says has to be funny or snarky or whatever. I have a character that I'd like to just sprinkle a little bit of humor and a little bit of snark in there every once in a while. Not everything he says comes out that way, but every once in a while he gets a little salty and he might say something a little, you know, never mean, but just a little kind of sarcastic. And I try to do it in ways that it comes across as funny or just making the reader smile a little bit when he says something like that. And they say, yes, that's him. If they have a little bit of humor or sarcasm or something, some emotional that can be conveyed through their dialogue. So they're not just flat, two-dimensional all the time. You might have a friend that, has a dark sense of humor. Maybe take a little bit of that and sprinkle it on a character. I have friends that we have dark senses of humor, and so I just kind of pull from that. Like, if these two characters were me and my friend talking, what would we say? How would we say it? And there's nothing wrong with kind of pulling and drawing from your personal experience. Kind of bleeds into that, right? What you know? Well, you know a whole lot more than you think. You know about human emotion because you've experienced it, witnessed it, seen it in action. So you know how to write about it. You just have to kind of stop and give yourself a little room and don't try to force it so much. So these rhythms of language and emotion, they have force of evidence. Someone is laying out a case or someone is trying to convince somebody in an argument. And that's a perfect opportunity to kind of raise the stakes, add some tension to your scenes and to your chapter, and maybe take words that you've heard, but put them in an argumentative setting. And how does that change things? I would also recommend taking a book that you enjoyed and getting a copy, like maybe from a used bookstore, one that you don't mind writing in, and rereading it with this kind of thought in mind. Like, where are there everyday phrases, but in unusual or high tension scenes and what's happening around it? And you can make little notes in the margin or highlight them if you're using an e-reader or something like that, and make a little note to come back to that and just notice how whatever book or whatever author you're reading handles that. And I'm certainly not saying that you should read that and then copy what they're doing. We definitely do not want any plagiarism, but just see how they treat it and then apply that how to your words that you have. And it can be inspiration. It doesn't have to be do it exactly the same way they do it, but just see how it's done and see how different genres handle it. So, pick, if you normally read sci-fi, pick a thriller and see how the same type of emotions and words are delivered in those different scenarios. You can draw from that. How did they react? Would your character react similarly? So just think about it. Give it a try. Write a little scene, a practice scene. See how it feels. I think the biggest takeaway from this is, you want your readers to feel oriented and connected to the story. And using emotion to do that is baseline. I mean, that's how you do it. They want to see themselves in the hero. We all do. So make it easy for them. Don't make your hero so perfect that your reader can identify with them. Give them some flaws. Now, I write science fiction and I write contemporary romance, and both are about people. Now, of course, in science fiction, they're not all human, but they have some type of emotion, whatever alien being they might be. They're not robots, or, well, there is a robot in my story, but he's not projecting emotion, and his character is not designed to do that. He is a research assistant, so he is about numbers and doing the research, and that leaves my main character open to have the emotions and to have adventures with her crewmates and those sorts of things, so that she's not always working, that she has an assistant that gets these research results for her that she can then act on, and creates these adventures that they have to go on to find the thing that the research talks about. So you can write about emotions across genres, about people. Again, like I said, mine are about people. We all have emotions. Now, my science fiction does not have any romance in it, but it's still about the relationships of people who live out in the middle of space on a ship, and all they have are each other to rely on. And some of these people get along with each other and some of them don't. And what happens when you're trapped in a spaceship with someone you don't necessarily get along with? How much can you avoid them? At some point, you're going to interact. And how is that going to go? Everyone's going to get cabin fever after a while. How do you handle that as the captain of the ship when your crew has been out in space in the middle of nothing for so long, and somebody just wants to see a sunset? but you got to find a sun to see. So, but then in my contemporary romance, of course, excuse me, that is about love and romantic settings and things, but they're a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit more suspenseful, not completely. Maybe there's, in one of my books, there's an ex-boyfriend who's a stalker. And so the person, has to deal with that and her friends help her. And how does that work? And the police are involved and just all of this drama. But in the end, there's a happily ever after. In my romance books, there's always an HEA. So, but, you know, you've got a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it can't just be the same, boy meets girl, boy and girl date, boy and girl live happily ever after. That's pretty flat and non-interesting, and it's the same as every other one, every other story. Excuse me. So what do you do to spice that up, to make it different? Some people change the setting, and you have that romantic storyline, but with vampires. Or some people do write science fiction romance, and that's cool. Or historical fiction, and it's a fair maiden and a knight, or a fair maiden or a princess and a rogue, a criminal or a pirate, something like that. So you can create a whole new world, a whole new story. Your new big thing that you're creating that has never been seen before as a new writer can really be the same old thing, but told in a different way that's new and exciting. So, I write about human relationships, trust, loyalty, friendship in science fiction, trust, loyalty, friendship, and romance in my other series. So, but it's really all about the same thing. It's human observation, the way people interact with one another. Sometimes those interactions are extreme, and sometimes they're everyday things, but in an extreme setting. So give it a try, see what you think. Try it out. Try a couple of different ways, different settings or different words, and maybe in a meeting at work or something, just try to jot down a sentence that someone says and see what you can do with it after. See what kind of setting you could put that sentence in. So using this sort of technique and realizing that you're focusing on emotions and the human condition, of course, is going to work and be especially helpful in genre fiction. If you write memoir or something else, this is probably not quite as helpful. But the external premise can sometimes get very busy. You got this world building that you're doing, whether it's a small town for romance, and you've got to have all the people in the town, or there's magical systems or kingdoms and portals or prophecies and secret societies, or futuristic technology. All of that can be fun, and it's all kind of the story machinery. But you still got to pull the reader in. The reader will stay because of your characters, because they recognize what the characters are going through or feeling on some level. And they stay because someone wants something, fears something, hides something, loves someone, loses something. And I'm talking about your characters in the book. That everyday line reveals the person inside the premise. So think of it as one way of keeping these ideas is make a small list of ordinary lines, words, phrases, or even situations that catch your attention, even for a fleeting moment. Even if it's just a snippet, you don't need the whole backstory, and it's probably better that you don't know. But just one little snippet. If it wasn't for my horse, I would have never gone to college. No context for that whatsoever. But again, I've never forgotten it. But keep a little journal, maybe on your journal app on your phone, or if you are like me and you prefer a pen and paper, just kind of jot it down and read through it once in a while. And just when something jumps out at you from the page, think about a line or a story. And if you get, kind of writer's block, you kind of get stuck, like what would happen next? You can flip through that list for inspiration and see what would maybe kind of spark a new scene or kind of jazz up the one you're working on. It's kind of like gathering ingredients that you're going to need later for your scene. And then as you build those scenes, adding all those ingredients together, you come out with something really beautiful and new and, never been done before because you've never done it. Another cool thing is to deliberately mismatch the ordinary and the extraordinary. So mismatch can create humor and tension, freshness. Maybe think about a dragon having to fill out paperwork for a permit for something. He needs a permit to fly. So he's got to go to the dragon version of DMV and fill out paperwork. That's kind of, bizarre. Like, who would think of that? Like, maybe a witch gets stuck in a parent-teacher conference, or, you've got a starship captain who has won many battles in space and commands all these people, yet they're stuck trying to get shoes on a toddler. So how do you how can you freshen up your story or create your story in a way that, again, these scenarios are still ordinary scenarios in extraordinary places. And I think mismatches work because of the contrast that they invite. The extraordinary character has to deal with something so deeply ordinary that it can be comical, or the ordinary person gets pulled into something extraordinary, and that can be thrilling, suspenseful, terrifying. But either one of those things is going to create energy and is going to pull a reader in because they're going to need to know, why is this happening? The energy is one of the reasons that genre fiction can be such a joy. It lets us explore real feelings with extra voltage without consequences. So again, back to the original example, a family argument in a kitchen is already emotional, but you add magic, inheritance, prophecy, and a flying car, and that scene gains a whole another layer or several layers. A first date can be very vulnerable and nerve-wracking, but what happens if it happens on a spaceship and the gravity keeps flickering in and out? Suddenly vulnerability has company. It's not just, is this person gonna like me or not, but are we gonna end up smashed up against the ceiling, together? So things like job interviews are stressful, but if your future employer is a ghost, that changes the game a little bit. Just play with it. Having fun when you're creating your story matter. So think about some of these ideas when you're stuck or trying to come up with an idea. What would my character do in this scenario? Go back to your little list of ordinary words and phrases and see if there's anything there that might fit the situation. So this week, I'd love for you to try something. Just pick an everyday sentence, something simple, something you've heard before, maybe something you've said, and then move it somewhere unexpected. Put it in a castle or a haunted hotel or a dragon market or a small town with too many secrets. Make a fairy tale turn sideways. See what changes. See what wakes it up. And then see what the sense becomes when the world around it shifts. I'd love to hear from you and tell me what you come up with. What ordinary line or everyday moment did you use, and how did you use it? How did you reuse it? In what story setting? And how did that feel? And if you're a reader, are there any stories that you've loved that did this well for you? I know there's probably a lot of Harry Potter fans out there, but are there other books and other genres that you felt took something ordinary and made it extraordinary? Or maybe you've had some awesome creative conversations with other writers, and what was something that stuck out for you? So I want to thank you so much for spending time with me today. I hope this episode reminds you to keep your eyes and ears open and your imagination ready. The next great story spark can come from a kitchen, a car, a grocery store, or someone asking where in the world you've been. Until next time, keep writing, reading, and noticing the ordinary magic all around you. And keep building that creative life that you are striving for. I'll see you next episode. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so by visiting buymeacoffee.com/Melissa L. Story, and your support is much appreciated.